Welcome to the Author's Corner. I'm Ethan Yang. Founded in 1949, the People's Republic of China has gone from a rural nation to one of the greatest international players on the world stage. Its political system blends authoritarianism with liberalism in a way that many scholars thought impossible, and as a result has become one of the United States' greatest geopolitical rivals. At the same time, with more information, we are starting to see some cracks in that geopolitical system. AIER's newest senior fellow, Ryan Yonk, is here to discuss those with us today.
Oh, thanks, Ian. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you as well. So, Chinese geopolitical history is nothing short of fascinating. They've had huge figures such as Mao. The current General Secretary Xi Jinping is also a very important figure as well when it comes to political ideas. Can you take us through that trend? They started off, as a very thorough Maoist communist country to the current hybrid model that is today. Can you just take us briefly from Mao to the current era?
Yeah, except I think we actually have to start pre-Mao a little bit. I think what we actually have to start with the transition out of the original dynasty, so the last of the traditional dynasties, and movement into the First Republic, which is really where Mao started to build a philosophy and an idea in response to both the original dynasty and some of the problems he saw in the Republic, because Mao was active quite a bit earlier than 1949. He was active at least in the 1920s in the founding of the Communist Party. And so through that First Republic period, then Mao starts to build along with a few others, and Mao ends up as the predominant one. And so Mao comes into power in 49, sort of at the vanguard of what he calls a revolution that's going to overtake China and transform it into the world power both it once was and that it could be. And this is important because this is Mao's vision. It's a vision of an ascendant China, ascending back to what it had been historically, but on explicitly Marxist, communist sort of mechanisms. And so Mao comes to power, stays in power through the 1970s, goes through a period of I'm going to call it terribleness, where even his successor would call it 70% good, 30% bad, would be how Deng would refer to it later on. I think he's got that wrong. It's much, much higher than that in terms of bad. But there will be a great leap forward, which will lead to a whole bunch of starvation. There will be the Cultural Revolution, which will attempt to entirely remake Chinese society in sort of this Maoist vision, which is an interesting combination of Leninism, Stalinism, and Marxism all rolled up in. It will eventually come to be called socialism with Chinese characteristics under his successor Deng. And then after Mao leaves power, dies, there will be a fight between sort of the four sub-lieutenants in the Communist Party. Eventually, Deng will come to power after a short interlude, and then we start to see China on the track we can really talk about today. Because in many ways, while we think about China in Maoist terms, after Mao's death in the 70s, China embarks on an entirely different geopolitical and economic experiment. Largely, the Maoist experiment fails. Mass starvation, lots of upheaval, lots of concern that the Maoist revolution actually isn't going to survive. And so those that come to power after him start to remake China in a way that will allow them to enter the world stage. The US will remember this from Nixon's trip to China as being sort of the beginning of this change in terms of US-Chinese relationships. And we'll see active relationships all the way through the current era. Less so under the Trump administration, but heavy under Clinton, heavy under Bush Jr., and relatively, I expect to be heavy under Biden.
So today, we see the Chinese employing very sophisticated statecraft tools, leveraging both economic as well as international institutions to accomplish their goals. And also domestically, they have a lot of very complicated policies as well. So can you give some examples of some of those tools that they're using to gain power?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a public choice scholar. That's sort of my background. And so I look at modern China and I see public choice issues abounding all around. One of the things, I mean, I have many complaints about Mao and his successors. Their ability to play politics and think strategically isn't necessarily one of them, because as they ascended, particularly the current current head of the Communist Party, he decided basically that he was going to reinvent China once again. So there had been this opening through the 1980s and 90s. There was mass corruption in the 1990s, which is really what leads him to come into power, is on a anti-corruption push to purge out some of those corruptions. And so he comes in with what he calls the Chinese dream. And he's going to implement the Chinese dream to remake China's place in the world. There was concern that China was moving towards the West, that some of the economic liberalization, while had been immensely good for China and actually stabilized the CCP's ability to rule, was starting to push them towards other things. And so Xi in particular takes a different tack with the world. And one of the things they do is they start to invest in developing nations around the world, known as the Belt and Road Initiative, which it's a fascinating initiative because it talks both about the Silk Road and a new road that's going to be developed based on silk trade in sort of overseas. And it begins to define a sphere of influence that China believes they should have, both based on historical claims, but also based on their geopolitical goals. And so they start to invest in the form of lending to various developing countries. And so it starts to change what had traditionally been a bipolar investment into sort of the developing world between the US and the Soviets in the 80s, 70s and 80s, into much greater role for China in that. And that reorients the geopolitical discussion, because the US spent about a decade or so as the primary investor, not doing a lot, but there wasn't anyone really challenging that, and China's done that. And so as part of that, they've made an interesting public choice calculation, because it works because they gain influence, but they've also decided to do it primarily through lending rather than directly just building the things, which tightens the reins over a number of these places and makes them much more tied to Beijing than they might be if it was simply development funds that were given. And that's started to get substantial pushback. Greece and Italy joined the initiative initially as part of it. Europeans, as China ramped up their control over places they invested, started to push back very, very strongly against it. Internally to China, there's a second example that I think is worth bringing up, and that is the surveillance state that developed under Xi. Because you always had sort of the looming Communist Party in China. It always was in existence. But as Xi consolidates power and becomes, I believe, increasingly concerned about pressures within China that sort of cut against the ability of the CCP to continue to rule, you end up with an increased surveillance state. This is the social credit system. This is the Hong Kong security law. This is posturing towards Taiwan again, that starts to ramp up and try to consolidate tracking to raise the cost of opposition to the regime, to prevent sort of the development of large-scale movements against that regime.
And that's, at least in my eyes, it seems like the first cracks in the wall, because the regime you don't tighten down on your society when things are going well. You do that when things are not looking too good.
Yeah, no, I think that's on average correct. So we see that there is definite concern. If you go back, there were lots of predictions about what China would become. Most of those have not borne out particularly well in terms of greater liberalization in any sphere except for the economic sphere. But there clearly are movements within China pushing up against the regime as it currently exists. As much as China likes to message that Xi is universally beloved, those numbers are fairly soft and largely constructed by the state itself. And so there is, I think, this tension. If you look at the Hong Kong protests, there's a reason why the Hong Kong security law got put into place. It wasn't simply because China wanted to assert authority. It's because there was a real and growing movement alongside increased contact from mainland cities with Hong Kong that started to breed interactions that they viewed as troubling. And so there was a desire to crack down on that movement in Hong Kong. They never liked it. They always would prefer it would go away. They would periodically arrest people there, but it became an increasing priority as those ideas started to spread. We've seen this before. This is 1989. This is at the end of the secondary transition, before real widespread economic liberalization. You see an uprising in Tiananmen Square, which is emblematic of a larger set of issues going on in China. It just happens to be the one we remember because it was a made-for-TV incident.
And a lot of very smart, political scholars have staked their careers on the idea that China through liberalization, through economic liberalization, become a democracy. Some people gave the year 2005. Obviously, that was incorrect. But many people in the American foreign policy establishment are trying to just say like that idea is completely false. I'm skeptical of it. I think there are merits to the idea that liberalization causes internal issues when it comes to pushing for more democracy. So, what do you think the people who predicted liberal democracy by 2005? Where do you think they went wrong? But also, what were the merits of their argument in the first place?
So the argument was a pretty standard one out of political science and international relations. It is the democratic contact hypothesis, borne out relatively well over time, that as economic liberalization would happen, you'd have more contact with democratic countries, which breed democratic movements. Now, there was up to China's liberalization in the 70s, 80s, and particularly in the 1990s, those two things tended to go together in lockstep. This is the Russian example. This is the Soviet example that would eventually become Russia. So they have economic liberalization, and what happens as that occurs, you have destabilization. Now, there was a problem, there was a difference in that, and that is it was a weak economy that was in decline rather than a growing economy. And so I think one of the things is we didn't really understand the trajectory that Chinese economic development was on, and that there was a whole bunch of catching up left to do that wasn't going to necessarily get tied to anything else. It's a pretty simple concept in economics. Catching up growth is far easier to accomplish than cutting edge growth. And I think the actual problem for China today is they've worked through much of their catching up phase. I don't think they're entirely caught up. Now they have to figure out how to maintain economic growth on the cutting edge. And so many political scientists believed that through that economic liberalization, you would see naturally tied political liberalization. I think part of what we have learned from the Chinese example is they can, in fact, for some period of time be done separately. I actually remain a believer that eventually the long-run predictions will be borne out. I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's necessarily on a short time frame. But as you increase wealth, that especially if wealth continues to go and you keep open markets and economic liberalization going, you'll eventually see this happening. Now, what's going on in China right now? Pullback from economic liberalization, increased in state-owned enterprises, greater regulation. This is Jack Ma ran into a whole bunch of trouble with the Chinese government precisely because they viewed him as a risk on this other political side rather than the economic side. If Jack Ma only ran his business and didn't care to comment on other things, he probably is allowed to continue on. And so what you see is that these things are linked, but it's not necessarily inevitable that will happen, and eventually a regime starts to pull back from economic liberalization when they become concerned. And I think that's where China is largely at right now. We've known for a while that their growth statistics are heavily inflated. We've also known for a while that their banking system has fundamental problems, that understanding how the banking system works requires a deep understanding of the Chinese Communist Party because they are interlinked in sort of lockstep. And so we've seen this reduction in economic liberalization. And this is really, I think, where Xi has started to resemble Mao in some important ways. And that is control over the economic sphere, unlike his predecessors who were content to allow for economic liberalization because economic growth meant hundreds of millions or a billion people were being lifted out of poverty, which has a stabilizing effect. Now that that's occurred, as people get wealthier, they start to want to self-actualize in different ways, and that becomes problematic for any authoritarian regime, including the Communist Party.
And I think what we're getting at here is that China's move, in order to become globally influential, in order to have the power that they want, they need to have a good economy. They need to engage with the world. They need to embrace, trade and relationships with other countries. But they, at the same time, like you mentioned, that's dangerous to them, and they want to tighten their grip on the population as well. So I think there's basically a rock and hard place that's coming up. So and also if you look at Chinese history, this always happens. They have these empires, these dynasties that get super powerful and close themselves off because foreign influence are causing trouble. So this to me looks a lot like history. So what do you see today? What are the contemporary issues that the CCP is going to have to grapple with?
There's a couple of big ones. I think the biggest one is they have to grapple with rising costs in China. So you see rising real costs and economic growth that is sluggish in response to that, and that's going to cause some stagnation. And the Chinese populace has come to expect substantial increases in standard of living year on, year out, and then especially as they look over decades. There was an expectation that the next generation should be substantially better off than the current generation. That's measurably harder now as people have lifted up. And so some of what was able to be done and be counted as big wins is no longer as simple. And so economic growth is a real problem. They seem to be going down the old Soviet model, which is they want satellites attached to them that they have a sphere of influence with, and it could work for a while, but eventually those things start to stagnate. You see less ability to grow, less entrepreneurship going on in the lock system, and then suddenly it starts to collapse. This is the Soviet Union. Eventually they collapse under their own weight. The second one is technology has changed the world. As much as the Chinese love to have the Great Firewall of China, I spent a lot of time teaching in China. Most students I talk to, they know how to get around the Great Firewall. They all can. So I often teach, and I would use videos in my usual classes, and I would say, oh, I can't do this. So I'd bring it over on a jump drive. And starting about 5 years ago, their response was, don't bother. We can all get around the firewall. We can all get to it, no problem. And so this is an increasing problem for China. In response to that, they may try to crack down, which will increase the pressure from below and cause them additional problems. So they put themselves in a tough spot. Now they can become more authoritarian and maybe maintain power. Of course, we see what happens over long run. If that happens, you see revolution, you see lots of fall apart. Or they'll be pushed towards greater liberalization overall. The current head of the CCP does not want to go to more liberalization. He views himself as a Maoist type figure. He wants to bring China into the next step, holding on to this socialism with Chinese characteristics. And he's bet that he can do that. And thus far, he's managed to, but he faces some substantial problems. He has real problems with minority groups in China. The fringes of the country are very difficult to rule, as they always have been in Chinese history. This is not new. And the world is increasingly watching those activities.
And it seems like the mainstream policy atmosphere in the United States seems to have a glorified view of how powerful China is. You have people on the left, like President Biden, who looks at China's economy and says, that's unstoppable, so therefore we need to emulate that with more state spending on our end. You have people on the right who are saying all the liberalization measures have failed. We need to take action now. We need to hit hard. But it seems to me, and especially based on your talk, that China is really not doing well, especially now given COVID. Their Belt and Road Initiative has pretty much blown up. Countries are becoming very skeptical of dealing with them. The West is pretty much all mobilized against them. So do you think that China's behavior in its own right, especially given all the things you've just mentioned, is self-sabotaging to their ambitions? And how do you think U.S. policymakers should move forward knowing that?
So there's a bunch of things packed there, Ethan. So let's start with the last one first. And that is that policymakers made many of these same arguments about the Soviet Union. That in fact, it was an unstoppable force. We should emulate them. We should move to more state involvement in the economy. We know that was a terrible idea. It remains a terrible idea. That is not the answer. There's also was a narrative of an ascendant Soviet Union, just like there's a narrative of an ascendant China, and a sort of falling U.S. influence or Western influence. I think both of those are myths. We've seen China take on an additional role in the world as they've grown and developed, exactly as we would expect as wealth increases in a country. They're suddenly more able to focus on world politics, world engagement, but I don't necessarily view them as singularly ascendant in the 21st century. I think that's an overstatement. I think both sides miscalculate China because China faces some significant internal and external problems. That being said, China is continuing to get wealthier. So growth is happening. It's just probably not the growth they claim. And as they get wealthier, they'll have increased influence. It's exactly what you would expect would occur. And so I think a posture with China is really one is I go back to the fundamentals of free trade. So sometimes we engage with a trading partner and we see that they're cheating or they're sponsoring or they're putting tariffs on us. And what do we want to do? We want to respond in kind. Turns out we're not made better off by responding in kind. We just end up in this escalating. So I continue to support free trade, engagement, while also being willing to call out human rights abuses and problems that exist in China. Pretending that China doesn't have problems doesn't do anyone good on the international stage. And so I don't love tariffs. I think they're a terrible plan almost uniformly, partly because A, they don't work, and B, they manage only to make everyone worse off. On top of that, the more aggressive posture that some on the right want to take, I think can needlessly push us towards the brink of world conflict. And so I don't know that that's the only, I don't believe that's the only possible solution. I think substantive engagement with China, bring them into the sphere of countries without compromising the basic principles of the liberal order is the way to do it. And there's a reason why China would have an incentive to do that. They want access to world markets. They need access to world financial markets in particular. So we may be able to pull them there. Now, will it work? I don't know. My prognostications might be just as off as the ones that predicted full democracy by 2005. But I think over time, sort of the traditional approach of economics about free trade, process of engagement is likely to work better than anything else. The same basic principles hold. China is not a special case. It is the same case repeated over and over again in human history.
And with that, I think we'll call it one very insightful and informative interview. Thank you, Ryan, for hopping on the show with us today. To our viewers, if you are interested in looking at more of our content, make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and as well as check out our website at AIER.org. If you really like what you heard and you want to support more cutting-edge research and thought just like this, please consider becoming a donor. All that information and more can be found at AIER.org. Thank you.